There we go. So, hey, everybody. Again, my name is Andrew King, editor-in-chief of Canadian Musician Magazine. Thank you for joining us for Make the Most of Your Studio Time. Whether you are a recording veteran or maybe about to lay down some tracks for the first time in your career, we want to make sure that you're ready, prepared, confident, and basically just able to go in stress-free and do what you're there to do. Lay down the best possible performances to get the best possible tracks of your music. Now, joining us for this one, who I will welcome to the fold in a moment, is Kevin Dietz, freelance producer, engineer, also the head engineer at the iconic Metalworks Studios. Kevin's had a hand in recordings by a wide variety of artists, some true legends. We're talking Randy Bachman, Tom Cochrane, Alexisonfire, Protest the Hero, The Glorious Sons, SonReal. I'll ask him about some other stuff he's got a hand in. And again, my name is Andrew King, editor-in-chief of Canadian Musician, as well as a few other magazine titles. And it's a pleasure to have you with us. Kevin, pleasure to have you with us especially. And yeah, thanks for joining us. Fill us in. I mentioned some of your heavyweight credits. Anything that you're working on right now you might want to let people know about?
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me. And hi, everyone who's joining in. Thanks for being here. Yeah, it's been a really busy start to the summer. Most recently, I mixed a live concert for a Canadian rock band that I probably should not reveal until they reveal what they're going to do with this thing. But that was pretty fun. Working with a great blues rock band called the Road Heavy, who we just found out we both know.
Shout out to the Road Heavy.
Shout out to the Road Heavy. And what else? Lots of just kind of one-off mixes and various studio sessions. It's kind of my schedule is like a checkerboard of all kinds of things going on. It's great.
Bang on. I mentioned too, like you wear some different hats in the studio: producer/engineer, producer or engineer, or mix engineer, which is great because we're going to be drawing on a lot of those experiences here. Quick thing to let you know about too, everyone that is registered that can hear my voice right now is going to be entered to win 5-year subscriptions to Canadian Musician and our sister mag Professional Sound, as well as a copy of Modern Recording Techniques. It's yeah, pretty authoritative text approved by the Audio Engineering Society. Give you some tips on how to lay down yeah, your tracks going forward. So really quickly, we're starting out basically here. We're going to jump into some more meaty in-studio tricks drawing from Kevin's experience. But really quickly, just to fill everyone in so that we're all on the same page going through here, the personnel. If you are about to enter studio, whether we're talking a big room like Metalworks or a small room, maybe like your bedroom, where a lot of recording gets done these days, and sometimes for projects that you see on the shelves by some artists that might surprise you. Yeah, give us a walkthrough here about who are some of the different people that you can expect to encounter in the studio in a session, maybe going beyond, yeah, if you're a band, obviously you're gonna have other musicians. If you're solo artists, you may want to tap some other players to come in. Actually, there's a place to start, Kevin. If it is a solo artist, like a studio like Metalworks, if someone makes it known that they want to record with you, do you or your colleagues with the studio like ever provide the service of maybe hooking up different artists that might collaborate well on a project?
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of musicians, for sure, if someone comes in and they're a solo artist, or it's happened in the past that there's a band, but they're sort of incomplete. Maybe some members just left, or the band split or something. And you know, half of the members want to keep going, or yeah, but most typically if it's a solo artist, studios, engineers, producers are they're probably your best bet for finding session musicians to help complete your project. Absolutely.
Okay. And again, that's something that you can figure out beforehand, but feel free to leverage the expertise of the people you're working with. So engineer, and I've got the S in brackets here. So in your experience, and I'm sure it's come both ways, but maybe there's a split here. Is it more typical that someone will engage your services as an engineer, and then you'll figure out where you're going to be recording, or the opposite, where maybe someone says, I want to record at Metalworks or X Studio, and then there's an engineer that kind of comes with that?
Well, in my particular case, it's both.
Mhm.
Because I was on staff at Metalworks for such a long time and still maintain the head engineer position there. Uh, Quite often, people will call up that studio, just like any studio. People might call up Noble Street or Revolution or Union Sound, wherever you might decide to record, and say, we want to record our project here. Uh, who do you have? Who do you recommend? And the studio will be able to provide a lot of options. Conversely, I often get hired a lot, um, more so than that now, just because people want to work with me in particular, and then from there we choose a studio.
Bingo. Okay, so it could go either way. I guess it depends on your individual situation.
Yep.
Are you ever on projects where there's multiple engineers, whether that's, and I guess I don't mean so much like someone does 3 songs with you and then 3 songs in a completely different scenario that make up an album, but are you ever working on the same material as another engineer in some cases?
It's That's not as common. I think the aspect of that would be more common is on larger sessions, or definitely bigger budget sessions. There's oftentimes an audio editor present. So
Mm,
just for efficiency's sake, so when a take gets done, it goes over to someone else and they kind of comp things together and just massage things into place if that's the vibe of what's happening, and you go from there. But normally there is one dedicated engineer. Oh, I guess I should say, because this is how I started. In a major studio, you'll often find an assistant engineer who is, their job is, well, it's pretty self-explanatory, is to assist the lead engineer on the session for whatever they need. It's their extra set of hands, their extra set of ears.
mhm. Okay. And then, yeah, you've probably seen in liner notes before, and much like Kevin, in some cases, the engineer and producer is the same individual. Now, I'm going to take a stab at this, and Kevin, please correct me if I'm wrong. But our friend Ryan Worsley, Echo Plant Recording Studios out on the West Coast, just wrote a piece for us in Canadian Musician about this. Basically, the difference between producer and engineer, which sometimes are the same person, but the producer is basically overseeing the session and is the one in charge of taking your vision as an artist and helping to translate that to the engineer, to the technical staff, and basically from a macro level, make sure that the project is coming together as it should, as the artist envisions. The engineer, on the other hand, is the science, the physics of the whole thing, who's using the equipment, the technology to get the best versions of your performance and try things out from a technical level, but basically to fit into the map that you and your producer have handed to them. Is that accurate? Do you want to add anything to that?
I would say that's 100% accurate. Yep. I mean,
Spot
there's a lot of, nuance in there as well, but yeah, I would say overall that's 100% accurate.
So then, maybe some advice for all these engineer, producer, mixing engineer, mastering engineer, yeah, just a general idea of how one might go about finding who they want to work with, who's going to make for a good fit. Maybe even, if I can be so, like a red flag as to something that might tell you why you shouldn't work with someone, or maybe we'll just keep it positive.
I'm sure it's easy to, come across red flags on why you shouldn't. I think everyone can. Well, here's the thing. Referrals is everything. It's not the kind of industry, making music, where you kind of open the yellow pages and go, I'm gonna look up, producers, engineers, whatever. You certainly can go about it that way, but I would say 99 times out of 100, that's not the way it goes. It works. It's through your network, and if you're a band or an artist and you're involved with other artists, you're playing shows, you're in those circles. I would imagine that you'll have other artist friends and other band friends that have done recordings as well. And yeah, it's really all through referrals and your network, I would say.
Mhm. And then I guess have you ever had it the case where like someone is a big fan of, say, the Glorious Sons and is looking in the liner notes, there's Kevin Dietz, and maybe get a call that way, like not so much I know this band and refer to you, but rather I love the way that this product sounds. Can you help me get somewhere like this?
Yes, I would say that in the sort of history of producers and engineers, even men and women at the top of the producer, engineer, mastering engineer food chain, that's exactly how they get a lot of their work, is because people look in the liner notes. I won't go into details, but I know for a fact I can. My head is just filling with all examples of this from my own career and from others of people I've really greatly admired. It's that's 100% how it works.
Awesome. I think we're off to a great start here because we've got some quality questions rolling in. Please feel free to keep those coming. We'll have a question period shortly. So moving on from personnel into, and actually some of the questions pertain to this, pre-production and rehearsal, not exactly the same thing, kind of go hand in hand. First off, yeah, break us off pre-production. For those that don't know, what is, and I guess we can cover these all at once, what is pre-production? How does it work in your experience? And maybe give us an idea as to why that's vital to being ready to enter a studio that you are paying for and just slay it, quick, easy, get it done.
I think that the pre-production aspect, that might be the most important thing of what we're talking about tonight. I think that's I think that's the most important part. Pre-production really is, it's the best thing a band or artist can do to make the most of their studio time, 100%. Because a band or artist who knows their parts and has practiced and refined their songs, they're really doing their part toward having a very productive studio session. And likewise, a producer or engineer who's involved in the pre-production is also like miles ahead of the game, so that collectively when you enter the studio, you're all on the same page, you've gone over stuff, you're just prepared, you have a map, you got all your supplies packed, you're ready to go out into the wilderness. So I mean, how it works, the best case scenario is to have the producer / engineer. I think for the purposes of this discussion, producer and engineer are often going to mean the same thing. More and more these days, the producer and the engineer is the same person, more or less. It's just in this day and age, that's how it ends up working. I know for myself, I'm producing, engineering, mixing a lot of projects all together, but that's sort of just a little aside. But yeah, for pre-production, the best case scenario is to have the producer or engineer go over the details of the songs, the individual parts, the arrangement, any riffs, any drum patterns with the band, multiple times, so that you can practice it outside of the studio, so that you're not having to point these things out and adjust on the fly when you're in the studio and all the mics are set up and the clock is ticking and whatever else, because that can just lead to frustration. So I mean, it can be as simple as playing through the song multiple times and focusing on really honing the parts, or oftentimes you'll do a simple recording, just basic, so you can focus in on the parts and have them isolated, so you can solo things and go, okay, see, so you're playing the riff like this, let's try it like that, let's do another take of it. And so oftentimes it can be kind of like a pre-recording almost, scratch
Right.
tracks or whatever.
So the line that we can draw between these two then, like pre-production, pertains to the material, your song, your arrangement, riff, A to B, transitions, etc., like what's on the page. Rehearsal, practice, more to do with whether it's individual, you as a musician getting your parts down like second nature, or the group recording collectively, coming in and doing that, getting just so tight that no water's coming in or out. I guess in either case, taken together, like how do you know when you've got this down enough that you're ready to, step into a studio and be on the clock?
Um, that's a tricky question. Oftentimes, you just know, and that's why, I mean, you want to hire a producer because you're trusting them to help bring your vision to life and to be a second set of ears. That's one of the best things about pre-production with your producer slash engineer, is that it brings a fresh set of ears to the table. And if a band is used to just playing and rehearsing a song together, they're kind of in that band mentality. They're not, oftentimes aren't, or they've gotten to a point where they've been about as sort of objectively critical as they can of their own music. And it's sort of like, okay, well, what now? That's a great time for a producer to come in and really hone and refine the parts. So what you touched on just earlier, individual practice and collective rehearsal and all that, both very important, because in the pre-production stage, it's very important for each individual musician to have practiced and really learnt their parts. If there's some tricky drum fills, or just being able to nail a guitar riff or play the bass part in time, whatever the case, each individual musician should be practicing those parts on their own. Once those parts are narrowed down and everyone has decided, yeah, okay, we like this for the bass part, we like this for the guitars, we like this for the drums, then it's up to those musicians to practice that individually, so that when they come together collectively to rehearse, everyone's just really strong in their own lane, and then collectively it just sounds great. So I mean, I think that's a responsibility of the producer, is to say, yeah, we're still a little shaky on this song. I think it needs a little more work, or you guys need to tighten up a little, and we need to practice a little more or focus on this area of it, and then we'll be ready for the studio. So it's sort of like a collective thing, how when you're ready. It's just an ongoing discussion between everyone and your trusty producer.
Right on. Yeah, and as you said about, producer and engineer in a lot of cases being the same person, especially in this day and age, the climate we find ourselves in, shrinking budgets, etc. But just to, unpack something that you mentioned there, I think a real key takeaway of what Kevin just walked us through here is that, like, pre-production, say you can't afford to have your producer around when you're doing this, even just undertaking this process on your own, though, is it fair to say, like, basically you just need to be dissecting every single individual element of what you're doing? Because in the studio, it's easy for, well, whether it's the engineer or audio editor, as Kevin mentioned earlier, like, they can be pulling up soloing tracks and basically listening to the way that a stick is hitting the snare, or maybe a bit of pick scratch on a bass string. Like, you just really have to consider every single moving part and how it contributes to the whole. Is that fair? Like, basically, as a guiding principle, if pre-production with a producer just isn't possible or realistic?
Absolutely. In my experience, though, I would say that I can imagine a few scenarios where it might not be possible, but I could think of more scenarios where some form of pre-production is possible. I was just out, I don't know, maybe a month ago at a band's rehearsal spot, first time hearing the songs, and I just took some iPhone recordings of them in their jam space, and they've all adjusted their levels so that they can hear each other, and for whatever reason, iPhone microphones, when you do a little recording, you can get some pretty high levels and still maintain a tiny bit of clarity. So I just got some basic iPhone recordings so that I can then put them on my computer and chart out the song and have a good idea of what's going on there. It's not ideal, because you want more detail to go by, to listen to, but that'll be our next step. Another band I worked with recently, I'm not sure exactly what their setup is, but they're able to do some basic multi-track recording at their rehearsal spot. And they sent me very good demos that they just get, kind of mix themselves and stuff. But that's fine. I don't really need the multi-tracks necessarily because I could hear everything clearly. I wasn't able to get there with them or whatever the situation was. But they sent me some great pre-pro demos, is what we would call those. And I listened to them, charted them out, had a few listens, thought about this and that, and then got back to them with a few ideas. I even loaded those files, those MP3s, into Pro Tools, and found the BPM, and then actually chopped them and gave them a rough example of a new arrangement, because I thought the songs might have been a little bit too long, some of them. So there's always different ways. There's the ideal situation. I've also done it where I've been with a band in the studio that we were going to record all the overdubs in. The studio owner was a friend of the band, and he said, yeah, you guys can come in for the day and just bang out some demos. So we did like a multi-track pre-pro demo in a pro studio, and we were lucky to be able to do that. But there's just a range of ways it can happen, but it really should happen. So, but to get back to your point about if for whatever reason it doesn't line up and everyone can't get together, then yeah, very important for the musicians to be really focused and as objective as they can be, and work out as much of this stuff as possible ahead of time.
Very cool. I'm getting the feeling here, and we'll talk about this shortly, but that this is very much the opposite of a one-size-fits-all type scenario in recording. That you and the artist and anybody else collaborating, this can take a lot of different shapes and forms, but I guess you're kind of going on the idea that everyone's working in good faith towards the best possible results here. So then, yeah, I guess we'll approach this from the perspective of, you've chosen, I guess we don't even have to pick one way or the other. When it comes to figuring out where you're going to record, and I've got a bunch of bullet points here, cost is one that people are already starting to ask about. So we'll try to answer a lot of these here. But choosing a studio, like let's say that you are tapped as the engineer for the project. Kevin Dietz is working with Band X, and Band X is trying to decide whether we, enter a big professional facility or maybe try to do this budget consciously. How do some of these different things factor into how to go about making a well-informed decision?
One of the biggest factors in doing that effectively, doing it cost effectively, is consulting with your producer / engineer. Most definitely. Right off the top, one thing I thought of as you were saying that is that we are, I don't know, I'd be interested to know who's joining us from outside of the GTA. We're here in the Ontario, big Ontario region here, but in this area, in Toronto and outlying areas, we are blessed with a lot of studios of various sizes, but very professional standards. So there are a lot of options. Like myself, I sort of have a network of places that I find myself at most often. I know what I like. I have some gear of my own. I know what I'm capable of doing remotely or off-site or in my own place. So it's really important to consult with your producer engineer about that.
Okay. Ballpark here, and just drawing from, again, I know that this is going to range very, very widely. Maybe even just walking us through, though, like the different scenarios one might find themselves in. Like how frequent is it that you'll be in a place with an hourly rate versus a daily rate versus a more kind of on spec, cut this project over the next couple weeks, here's what it's going to cost? Like, what are some of the more typical cost arrangements that you might find yourself in?
For a professional studio, normally you'll be, if it's a big tracking session, you'll absolutely need to book out an entire day. Again, you're probably going to hear this a lot from me, and it's not a cop out, but again, it's like you've got to consult with the producer or engineer, because hopefully you're hiring them. This is why it's important to have someone with some experience, because they can help guide that thing. They sort of know how long, oh, you want to do this many songs complete with overdubs and everything? Okay, we're going to need about this much time. So they can really help with that. But typically studios will book out with a day rate, and they'll also have an hourly rate. And that kind of goes in more toward overdubs. I mean, you know, like vocal sessions, say, where you might need 3 hours to 4 hours to do a couple songs, but then after that, the vocalist isn't going to be able to continue. You know, you can't do vocal overdubs, or very few can, you know, do a 8 or 10 or 12-hour day of all vocals. It's nuts. So in that case, you know, you'd be looking at an hourly rate. In the case of full band tracking, you're likely going to be dealing in days and half days. And studios can range anywhere from, you know, like a typical cost of a good overdub room is, I've found, to be around $400 plus tax for the day. There are a lot of great rooms around that rate. Mm-hmm. A big tracking studio, more. I don't know, because I'm actually thinking about this, and I don't know that I should be sort of, you know, ballparking and naming places and all that. You know what I mean?
Oh, no, totally. Fair enough. So we can say, and I don't think that is a cop-out, because this is a pretty like vast abyss of different scenarios.
It
options,
really is.
so you know what you're doing, how much time it's going to take to set up for, you know, if you're just going to do some vocal overdubs versus, you know, say trying to do something with a drum kit.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, but you know, it's fair to say that you can pick up the phone and call if you've got your eye on a facility. Like, you can get answers to the cost question very, very quickly. I guess it's just a matter of, we just kind of want to give you enough information that you're not going to be totally blindsided, you know, with your jaw on the floor and, okay, everybody, we have to go back to the drawing board here.
Well, yeah, let me interject there for a second, because that made me think of something. Again, I'm going to go back to, you know, consulting with your trusted producer engineer, because they're also going to know which aspects of that, like what you need to how do I put it? They're going to know like how much of your project you're going to need to track in a big room. They're going to know how much of it, okay, we'll do this at an overdub studio, or we'll do this at, you know, if you're an engineer and you have your own little spot, okay, we can do this at my spot. Or, you know, they'll have their network of people. So you might end up at a few different places, or you might end up all at one spot that's, you know, more budget friendly. And, you know, it's up to your producer to help you sort all that out. I personally, I don't ever expect an artist or a band to, you know this unless they've had, you know, experience doing it before, going into big studios, booking rooms, and they'll kind of quickly get to know the sort of range of it. But maybe a lot of people have it in their minds that, oh, you need, well, I mean, you know, oh, if I'm recording a song, I have to do it all in this, you know, big fancy studio, like all the, you know, top artists with huge budgets do. And increasingly so these days, that's not the case. You know, the technology and the quality of technology is available to everyone. So a lot of people have their own gear that can cover certain aspects where you don't necessarily need a big studio.
Mm-hmm. Your perspective is one I'm very interested in on this, because of the different titles that you've got. But it's been a debate going on for years and years, and things have been changing as technology gets better, as information is circulated more freely, sometimes good, sometimes bad. But all this to ask, like, at this stage, how different, and I know there are a lot of factors to this, but like in your experience, could something that was done on the cheap and say between a jam space and a tracking studio ever come out sounding as good as that, typical big budget, book out the studio for a couple weeks? Yeah, give it to us as straight as you're comfortable with. What's the difference in quality? How is where you're recording ultimately going to affect the finished product?
That's actually a great question, and there are a lot of variables to that.
Yeah.
There are, but there's a lot of factors that's dependent on how great the product is going to come out. The basic things you need to get a good recording are less. The base level things are less dependent on studio or technology or anything. It's you've got to have a great song and a great performance. That's number one. A great song and a great performance will, in less than ideal recording situations, will absolutely trump I'm embarrassed I said that word. Will a great song and a great recording will, or sorry, a great song and a great performance will, in less ideal situations, will far surpass a bad song and a crappy performance at Abbey Road Studios with unlimited budget. So that's kind of the main factor. And again, recording technology is affordable, and a lot of producers and engineers have their own setup that they can cover a lot of that. When you mention that, when you kind of pose that question, immediately who I thought of was one of my favorite producers of all time, Daniel Lanois. He famously does not use big commercial recording studios. Of course, he started out in Hamilton. He and his brother had Grant Avenue, which is a beautiful studio. They did a lot of great work there. But he recorded U2 in a house. He had a house in New Orleans where he set up a studio, and he recorded some just amazing albums there. Now, granted, he moves in like a Neve console and all these vintage microphones and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
However, if you sort of take that philosophy and scale it to your needs, you can often find that you can make it work for you as well.
Spot on. You just made me think of one, and actually, yeah, we'll roll right into it. Question period, because I have one for you. When you were talking about Lanois there, I was thinking, like, there's some really big examples of this, Exile on Main Street and whatever else. But for me, I was thinking of, I as a admitted nu metal fan in elementary school, I always kind of stuck with Incubus, and I remember one of their records, I think it was Morning View. Yeah, like they had rented out a mansion on the coast.
Yes.
So that Morning View cover art you see is, and basically brought in the engineer and just converted the house into a studio so that they could work at their own pace. All this to ask is, A, is that something or something similar to that you've encountered before? And B, like, is that, whether we're talking cost-wise or just comfort for you as an engineer and getting a good job done, how viable of an option is that these days?
Very viable, very much so. In fact, I'm thinking of a couple instances, things I've worked on recently and am currently working on, where we've done a bunch of recordings at someone's house. They have the space and they floated the idea. They said, what if we did the vocals? I can, build a little makeshift vocal booth, and you bring your mic and preamps and everything, and what if we just did it here? I said, that sounds great. And it turned out fantastic. We ended up doing some guitar overdubs and other instrument overdubs. A band I recently did, a Okay, I'm gonna plug this one because this might be interesting for people to check out.
All right.
I recently did an album with a band called JJ and the Pillars from Toronto here, and they just released their first single called Knuckles, and it's everywhere online, easy to find. We recorded, well, I think drums and bass were recorded in a big room. Everything else on that song, it was recorded in JJ's house, in his like big main room, big open concept house that he's in downtown Toronto. I just brought my stuff. We have like gang vocals and claps, and it sounds like we're in this big room, which we kind of are. But all the vocals, the acoustic guitar, some guitar overdubs and stuff, all done in there. And it sounds fantastic. We did a great job. So it's absolutely viable. For myself, I foresee that as, and I know from other engineers as well. I can speak for a lot of my colleagues in that, we collect gear, we buy microphones, and a lot of us are able to be mobile and remote. And when it comes to overdubs, you don't need a huge room and lots of microphones and a big console. You need that for recording drums, or if you're recording a big string section, or big, or a whole band live off the floor. If you're doing vocals, if you're doing guitar overdubs, bass, oftentimes if you have a pair of great preamps and the proper mics for the source you want to record, and the compressor, or what have you, readily available stuff, either that people own or you can rent, you can most certainly record remotely and in different environments like a house. And I actually love doing that. I've had a blast doing that with people.
All right on. I mentioned we had a really strong handful of questions at the beginning. A couple of them we already touched on, which is great. And a couple of them I'm seeing are going to be touched on in the second half of this. So yeah, fret not, those of you. Jeremy, some great questions here. One more to put in front of you though, and again, like, not asking for specific numbers here, and you can speak from your own experience or that of other engineers or at different points of your career. We've talked about the cost of studios. The question isn't how much is it going to cost to hire an engineer, but more just what are the factors that you're considering when you're pricing out a project? Like, we've talked about it not being a one-size-fits-all solution.
Mm-hmm.
Different things take different amount of time. Time is money, but that's not always the prime consideration. I've got to think in some cases, maybe not. Well, I'm setting it up too much. What are some of the different factors that you or other engineers have to weigh when you're trying to figure out how you're going to take on a project in a way that's fair and works for everybody?
You said something interesting just now that I've mentioned to bands and artists before. What you're really paying for, and like what's really valuable on a project or recording songs or album, what have you, what's really valuable is time, having enough time to do everything you want to do. And like you said, yes, time is money, right? Time costs money, blah, blah, blah. But looking at it in terms of, how much can you get the right amount of time to accomplish what you need to do? That's what you really need to be cognizant of. And for myself as a producer engineer on a project, that's one of my biggest factors is, okay, how much time do we need? Like, what is the scope of this project? Are we doing a full album, full production, everything? Okay, well, that's quite a bit. Is it a 4-piece rock band, or are we doing strings, piano, full orchestra? Like, what are the parameters of it? Maybe it's I've done pop music things that are mostly in the box, mostly virtual instruments and synths and programmed drums, and the only live thing are a couple guitar overdubs here and there and vocals. How much time do we need to do that? And how much of that requires a studio. So many factors. So yeah, the scope of the project is something I definitely look into, or that I definitely consider, and really talk with the band. Like, what's your vision? What are we looking at? Some people have very big, grand projects in mind, and that's totally cool. So it's like, okay, we got to figure out how to do that. We're going to need this much time. Are we going to need that much time in a big room, in an overdub studio, at your rehearsal space, some remote recording? So many factors.
There we go. Let's keep rolling here. Thanks again, folks. There's a couple that we'll put in front of Kevin shortly. Well, I realize I'm going through time, but I wouldn't call it a loss because I'm really enjoying this and we're getting some really good feedback here. Yeah, thanks, folks, for keeping the questions and the comments coming. This is great. So going into the studio, the first half we focused on everything before studio. Now it is time. We're walking into a physical space somewhere. So this one would differ big time whether we're talking about the Exile on Main Street versus somebody's bedroom versus a studio. So let's just call it a professional recording studio, whether that's Metalworks or somewhere smaller, but basically that has a name that operates as a commercial studio. No one's sleeping there. What will you need to bring? Just generally speaking, like some things that you as the artist want to make sure that you've got handy, and I guess these all go together. Like, what do you need to worry about as the artist who's renting and entering the space, and what can you expect to be there to have at your disposal as part of the facility rental?
Well, and part of choosing a studio, an important part of that is to make sure that that the studio itself has the proper equipment for what you're trying to do. You want to pick a studio based on, is it going to be good for what you're trying to do? If you're a 4-piece rock band and you want to just bash out some stuff, you don't want to necessarily rent a production studio that's got a bunch of synthesizers in it, and vice versa. If you're doing an EDM track or whatever, you're probably doing that on your laptop, but you don't need a like a big space to record drums in and things like that. So first off, you want to choose your space accordingly. As far as what to bring, it's very important that the artist, and again, consult with your producer engineer, that their equipment, their instruments, everything is in good repair, everything's in good shape, and that it's good quality and that it suits the type of music they're doing. If you're doing a metal song, probably make sure the guitar player isn't coming with a Telecaster and a Fender combo. And likewise, if you're doing a blues song and the guy shows up with a Schecter 7-string and a diesel amp, you might be off to a bad start. Drums, very, very important to have drums in good repair, because they're the most, that's going to be like the most inputs and the most microphones on it, the most moving parts, really, in a way. So it's very important to have drums in good repair, fresh drum heads, or just good sounding, well tuned. Very important for the artists and the band members, the musicians, to bring in quality equipment to play on.
There you go. I think, do some facilities have resident drum kits that you can take advantage of? And like, if so, is there ever, or is it common that there's like individual fees to take advantage of what might be at your disposal there? Or is it kind of like if you rented the room, anything under the roof's at your disposal?
It depends on the studio, but there are definitely studios that have house drum kits or a collection thereof, or some instruments or amps. It really depends on the studio. It's all individual to the place. Interesting point to bring up with regard to that is it's not uncommon to, if budget allows, to have a drum tech on hand. And oftentimes they might have drums for rent as well. So that can be a really handy thing. if you are a drummer who's not confident teching your own drums and tuning them up and everything, or you may only have one kit and, you know, like one snare drum, maybe that might be something to look into, just to make sure that you've got the best options for the music that you're trying to record.
Bingo. Okay. The different spaces, I guess, just a really quick primer. Control room, that's where your engineer is going to be based largely, where either the console or control center, if it's in the box. Um, and sometimes tracking is done in the control room, but that's a control room. The live room is the wider open space. Hopefully it's tuned to sound sweet. Usually, I mean, well, whether it's a direct line of sight or facilitated by cameras or something, your control room is going to be looking into the live room. ISO booths, isolation booths, so smaller rooms, tighter acoustic profile, vocals, some guitar tracking, etc. Are we missing some big ones? Like I know some places have like echo chambers and whatnot, but yeah, control room, live room, isolation booth. Anything else people need to know about kitchen, lounge?
Yeah, exactly. There you go. The other things are the kitchen and lounge, and in studios that are, you know, kind of one room, oftentimes I was just out visiting a producer who's building his own studio, and he's got tie lines to put mics in you can put an amp in the kitchen, you can put one in the lounge. You know, he ran it so you can put instruments anywhere and put microphones anywhere. So yeah, that kind of covers the layout of a pro studio.
Bingo. So what you might expect, and again, ask the engineers to how you can take advantage of these different spaces. Really interested about this one, not that we have to dwell on it long, but in terms of file and track management. So say you're recording someone at Metalworks that rented the studio for 2 or 3 days to do X tracks. Like how do you transfer those tracks to whether it's the artist or maybe in some cases the mixing engineer, mastering engineer? Where do those files end up being stored? Yeah, curious about that.
Well, that's definitely the responsibility of the engineer and producer to some extent. The artist, you bring up a good point here. Another thing that the artist should bring to the session is a hard drive of their own to take the files away, and you know that's their backup. When I'm working on a project, I have multiple USB drives, so I take a copy of everything. I encourage the artist to bring their drive, and we back up on that as well. So I'll work off of my drive, back up to theirs, also back up to my backup drive at home. Having backups is so important because it's not like the days of tape where everything exists on a physical thing. You know, these files can exist in multiple places, but one drive goes down and that's your record. There's all your hard work. So
Right.
Always have backups. So hard drives, bring hard drives. They're cheap and you need them.
Bam. So I've mentioned, like, going back, the producer is the one that is overseeing the session, liaising between well, they're wearing all kinds of different hats. You know, there's
Yeah,
jokes about sometimes being cook, psychotherapist, etc.
absolutely.
But with everyone in the room, yeah, like who runs the session? Who's got final say? I mean, it's all here, but explain a bit about kind of that social dynamic of, you know, who yields to who, and maybe how much an engineer or producer might push back on something versus the paying client. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you've hired a particular producer or engineer because you trust them to guide the general workflow of the session and the recording process. Like you said at the top, you know, it's it's important to have like a collective based in trust. That's a huge part of it. My philosophy is that my role as a producer or engineer is you know, to make the actual recording process as transparent as possible. So I want the band to be in artist mode and musician mode, not thinking about all the other elements. I want to make the environment feel natural for them as musicians so they can just perform. So in that way, I feel like overall it is the producer slash engineer. Okay, I guess the producer, but who is often the producer slash engineer. I would say it's
Right.
their responsibility to really oversee the project and or the session workflow, And I feel like the majority of the time, the musicians they know. I mean, that's why they've hired you. They're trusting you to handle that part of it that they might not have as much experience with, or that they simply don't want to have to worry about. They want to be in artist mode. They want to be in musician mode. It's interesting as far as who's quote unquote in charge. Well, you kind of figure out that dynamic ahead of time, and it usually kind of comes up naturally. And I mean, for me, it's always a give and take, because at the end of the day, it's not my record that we're working on, it's this artist, so they need to be happy with the end product. So there's always a give and take. I worked with one producer of very well-known producer on one record, and he's kind of known to be, I don't mean this in a negative way at all, but he's known to be like, he is in charge. When he takes on a project, I think his philosophy, well, he pretty much said as much. He's like, okay, you are trusting me to do your record. Let me steer the ship. I'm the captain. Let me do this. And he's someone with a huge track record, so it works. And it's not heavy-handed either. It was this one record was like, the most fun ever. I loved working with him. There's different approaches, but a lot of it is just is a give and take, and a sense of trust between the artist and producer.
You touched on this briefly, but like, to what extent will you, if you are a producer engineer, like, how much of this is social, where you are not so much just dealing with gear and or musicians, but people and feelings and interpersonal relationship conflict? Like, what do you have to go through to make sure that everyone's always comfortable, confident, and on task?
It's 100% that, I would say, because if you don't have that, you have nothing. Every business is a people business ultimately, whether you're at, like, the top or whatever. Every business is a people business, and we're dealing with music, we're dealing with art, we're dealing with people's artistic expression, their emotions. So the people aspect of it is paramount. It's everything. If you don't, that's your foundation, and it's also like, it's the beginning and it's the end of it as well. For me, that's my favorite part of working in music, is the people I get to meet, and we have fun in the studio. You've got to get work done, of course. You can't just be goofing around all the time, but man, you have some great laughs, and you have some great moments of, you get wowed by the music, or something spontaneous happens and you get all excited about this new thing that you hadn't planned for, and it's great. So that's a huge aspect. And I think the great producers of all time are ones who really strike that balance between getting the work done and delivering a high quality project, and also making the artist feel like they're doing their best work and having a great experience. I think those two, they go hand in hand. It's all in one. I don't personally feel you can have one without the other, and I mean, that's what I strive for.
Right on. Last one here, and then we will jump into some of these questions. Feel free to spit them at us while we're going here. But yeah, just some general tips here. I don't even think you need me for these, but just because I love the sound of my own voice. Like, how do you know when you hear something, or maybe it's like, how would the artist maybe be able to know, to see on your level when you've nailed it? That's a common kind of TV or film trope when you're in a recording studio, and everyone's putting headphones in the control booth, and it's like, that's the one, that's it, we did it.
Yeah.
What are you listening for? How do you know when something is good, when it's great, and when it just needs to be done again?
That's actually a tough question to answer. How do you know when it's great? It's a combination of so many things, and it depends on what you're recording and the vibe you're going for. The number one thing is that particular part or performance or song or whatever, is it putting forward the emotion that it's intending to? Is it really delivering the emotion that it's intending to? On a technical level, you know, you're listening for timing. Is it in the pocket? Is it in the groove? Does it need to be like right on top of the beat, or does it need to be laid back? Is that guitar solo in tune? Did you bend all the notes all the way up, or is it a little flat? Same thing with vocals. There's so many factors. It's so nuanced, and again, that's why you want to have a producer or engineer that you really trust. I think it's important. You reminded me of something. Sometimes musicians, especially if they don't have as much studio experience, they might be they might get very excited hearing themselves back, and they hear it taken and they go, wow, this is amazing, I'm so excited. And sometimes as a producer, you need to keep it positive, but you got to keep that in check, because you're like, yeah, everything sounds great. We're almost there. We just got to, we got to punch in a few parts, or let's do another couple takes, because I feel like we're almost there, but I think that you guys could even top that one, or whatever, So as the producer, or sorry, I shouldn't say as the producer, because we're talking about the perspective of the artist, but yeah, I mean, you should be able to rely on your producer to put you to work a little bit. That's not a bad thing when the producer says, you know what, let's do it again. It's not quite there.
Right on. I've got to think this one is largely about, as we've been talking about here, that time is the essence of this. But in terms of experimentation, and what I mean there is, like, well, in Canadian musician professional sound, we're privileged to have so many engineers, tell us about really cool mic space instrument combos that they've come up with to great effect. But like in a lot of these cases, it's the result of just trial and error. All this to ask, and again, I guess we'll keep it, you can choose whether it's coming from the artist saying, hey, I think this might be something cool to try, or whether you as an engineer want to be the one that suggests doing this. But like, tell us a bit about Sound Source's experimenting with how you're capturing things, and like, do you have any stories of spending 2 full days trying to get the tone right on the opening riff of a metal track?
No, thankfully not. I mean, who has the budget to, I remember working with one engineer who came up in the 60s and 70s and worked on a lot of big records, and he'd go, oh, we'd spend 2 days on a kick drum sound. I'm going, what a nightmare. But, I'm sure there were other experimental factors involved in some of that too, but no, I love that stuff. I love that stuff. I love on every recording I do, not necessarily on every song. It's what the song ultimately comes down to, what the song calls for. But I love on each song doing like something creative or something kind of spontaneous and putting that in there. I love that stuff. Yeah, how you manage that, how you navigate that. Well, going back to pre-pro. If you're thorough with your pre-production, you'll have much more time to try new ideas that pop up on the spot. So again, let's go back to the importance of pre-production. Artists will oftentimes have just come up with ideas like, I'm hearing this thing in my head, like I kind of want it to sound like this weird thing doing this, da da da, and they might describe a sound, and I go, okay, hey, why don't we try this? If you shout that from across the room, and I have a mic set up, and I just smash it through a compressor, and then we run it through a guitar amp or something like that. Honestly, I have so many stories of doing that kind of stuff that it would just take up. We could do 15 minutes, 20 minutes just on that alone of me rambling on about that. But it happens, and it's a fantastic thing. It's one of my favorite parts. But you've got to be, don't get lost down the rabbit hole on something that that isn't going to yield results. Quick thing to mention for the listeners, someone who is very famous for that is a producer, engineer, mixer named Sylvia Massey, and
Yeah.
she has this whole thing, Adventure Recording. Check her out on Facebook and YouTube. She posts videos all the time. She'll post these 2-minute videos just on her phone, and she'll go, "Hey, we're in the studio and we're recording guitars, and we want this kind of sound. So here's what we did." I saw one just a little while ago where she recorded a guitar sound through a piece of cheese in France. They recorded drums in like an abandoned nuclear silo. So you hit the snare drum and the reverb goes on for 10 minutes. She does all kinds of crazy stuff like that. Her famous one is on Tool's record Undertow. There's a part where they mic'd up a piano in the studio and destroyed it with sledgehammers and a shotgun. They would fire a shotgun at a piano in the studio, and to get the sound of it going like, "Brow!" It's just it's craziness. But yeah, Sylvia Massey, check her out. She has some awesome unconventional things she does, and she's all about that. And I think yeah, she comes up with some really cool stuff.
Her latest book is a couple years old, but you can get it at musicbooksplus.com for a discount because you're joining us right now. But it's called Recording Unhinged, and she breaks down a lot of these. Breaks down a lot of these scenarios, and it is a coloring book, so you can color in.
She did. She drew it all. She's like she's an artist. She drew it all too. Yeah.
So you can, with your green Crayolas, put the color into Danny Carey's hair shooting a grand. No, I don't know if that's in there. And I'll say this too, that because someone of Kevin's stature is recommending Sylvia, in the handouts you've got a PDF of our home recording feature from 2017. We didn't include our 2016 one, for which Sylvia Massey was our keynote interview. So aking@nor.com, hit me up. If you write me and say I want that, I'll send you a PDF of that article. Let's jump back into it here, though. And I guess we touched on this when we were talking about listening to takes and whether it works or not. But yeah, the playback, you're in the studio, you're listening on presumably a very expensive set of reference monitors, speakers. In some cases, you're listening to a track that hasn't been mixed, mastered. All this to say, like, what kind of guidance are you giving people, when they hear things in the studio to put into perspective? This is going to sound a lot different than it will coming through your Hyundai Elantra or whatever.
Yeah, I find that I haven't found, I don't think I've ever really run into an issue with that, where an artist or band, where their expectations were, kind of skewed in that way. I feel it's more common that everyone kind of understands it's the raw materials. However, you'll find that with an experienced producer or engineer, they the sounds coming out of the speakers on playback tend to be very good, which is the whole idea, right? That's kind of what you want. I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of high level, very well-known producers and engineers. And I mean, I remember one instance hearing just sort of like the unmixed playback of the drums for this one band, the very first song from this one band, and I thought, this sounds like a finished drum sound to me, and this is just the raw recordings, because you had like a top level producer and a top level engineer. I'm going, wow. I was just blown away. I remember that exact moment, going, oh, okay, so this is what I've got to work toward. This is what I've got to strive for. Unreal.
Cool.
So hopefully your producer engineer is giving you the best sounds possible right out of the gate.
Bingo. Last point, or I guess second last, because I've got one more for Kevin after this slide. But we'll take studio choice out of this, because I've got to think and maybe you correct me, we're not talking Led Zeppelin level recording here where, 2 weeks into something you might say, I'm just not feeling the walls in this place. Let's start over somewhere else.
Yeah.
I think we'd be wisest to keep it to personnel. But yeah, like just by, I guess, making major changes, I'm thinking negative, like this just isn't working the way we were hoping to, or we're not getting the return on investment that we were expecting, etc. Um, how do you know from either side, and it's probably more so the artist side, but maybe you can tell me if you've ever partway through a project distance yourself from it for any given reason. But just, yeah, how can you diplomatically go about recognizing that something is out of whack and going about trying to remedy that?
Again, communication and trust is key. And as the artist, you know, you definitely should speak up if you feel something isn't, up to the standards you were expecting. And as as a producer and engineer, but it's their responsibility. It's my responsibility, our responsibility to listen to the artist and listen to the band and talk to them way back at the pre-production stages, all going back to pre-production again, and talk about the vibe they're going for. Talk about what records they like, what kind of sound they're envisioning, have that discussion and, throw ideas at them as well. And, say, I think that if we did this kind of drum sound, or, if we use these type of guitars, go for more of an overdriven sound as opposed to really saturated, or blah, blah, blah. Really important to have those conversations up front and then check in during the process. Like it all comes down to just open communication and trust. Everyone's got to come into the thing, leaving their egos aside, having an open mind, and just having that sense of trust. And those things will hopefully not even come up. If they do, well, you've got to come up with an action plan to deal with that. And again, it's best to just keep ego out of the situation, and it's best to approach it like be a problem solver. It's in just like anything in life. The problem isn't always the problem. The problem is how you deal with the problem. If that's not too vague and
No, that works, and it's just a testament, like we've been talking about, that you're wearing a lot of different hats as a producer here in the studio. So maybe I'll challenge you to keep it, and I'm thinking it's probably pretty straightforward. But you come out of the studio. What defines success? Like how do you know that you've done this properly? Maybe outside of just having a recording that you put on and listen to and feel good about. Maybe that's all that matters.
Well, at the end of the day, it kind of is. The number one thing is the artist needs to feel like they've done their best work, and the producer and engineer should be really working to facilitate that. They should be proud of what they've done. It should match their vision, and hopefully the producer and engineer and mixer have added to that vision. They've taken that and even shown the artist, cool, all that, and we can take it to here as well. Ultimately, yeah, it's if you're feeling good about it, like I'm a big fan of old school punk rock. I love that stuff, but it sounds, the recordings are so gnarly. They're so lo-fi, but that doesn't bother me
How old school are we
in the
talking?
least.
Are we talking like 80s DC stuff? Are you talking Sex Pistols?
Oh yeah.
Okay, cool.
All of the above, but yeah, absolutely. Misfits, Dead Kennedys, all over the place. A lot of it is, it's kind of gnarly. It's kind of lo-fi, but the energy is there. So you've captured what you need to capture in that recording, and to me, that's success. It's that the music and the expression and the artist's emotion, what they're trying to get across, if that's well represented, then success.
Awesome.
And the artist, I would I would want the artist to feel that way too. It's great if I, love it and I'm all happy with myself. Oh, look at it. Oh, I did some great work on this. Fine. But if the artist doesn't like it, or if that's not the direction they wanted to go, then that's not success. So
Well put. This is awesome. Okay, jumping into questions here. I'm going to cap it in the interest of time, so we'll go through what's here. I've actually answered a few of these just directly with the people asking. So thank you for submitting. But for you, Kevin, do you prefer recording bass tracks, or I guess bed tracks is another synonym here? Do you prefer recording bass, like B-A-S-E? We'll call them bed for clarity here. Do you prefer recording bed tracks live as a band or individually? In brackets, the trade-off being feel versus control over the tracks.
Right, absolutely. I actually like a combination of that. Oftentimes you'll go into a big studio with the intention of, maybe you're only really planning to keep the drum tracks, or the drum and bass, or drums, bass, rhythm, guitar. You kind of determine that beforehand. And an interesting part of recording, what kind of makes it exciting, is that sometimes you never know what you're going to get on the day, right? Like there is an element of, you can plan it out and everything, but until you get the microphones in front of the instruments and the musicians sit behind them and start banging it out, you don't know what you're going to get, and there's so many variables that can come into play then. So for me, when I'm doing bed tracks, I like to hear the whole band playing together, unless there's a very specific reason why the drummer would just sit there and play it to a click track. I would prefer to have everyone set up, but isolated, so that the amps are in separate rooms or booths or something, and they can play along, so that we're all getting the vibe, even though we know we're going to replace those elements later, or if we're going to replace those elements later. So in all cases, I would prefer to have everyone set up and going, so that we can all hear what's happening. We can, in context, I guess is the key. So yeah, I like having everyone playing, and hey, it's good practice too, right? Even if you're not keeping the guitar parts or the bass parts or the vocal, it's like, okay, let's have everyone run through it at least a few times anyway, just so that we're locking in the vibe as much as the performance. I think, to me, that's very important.
Bang on. Okay, this is a specific scenario. So going back to the beginning, say you're a solo artist and you're hiring a session musician for your session, who may or may not be, well, in this case, not typically performing your material. So you're hiring them, introducing them to your music for the first time. What's the best way to help a session musician get prepared for recording on your project, especially if you're not handing them a pre-worked out arranged part, but are rather just relying on their expertise to get you where you need to be? Any tips?
Yeah, I mean, that situation has definitely come up in the past. Best thing is to give them even a rough, even that rough iPhone recording. Giving them something is, I think, is very important. Also, to say, like I said earlier, that here in the Toronto area, we're blessed to have a lot of great studios at our disposal. The level of talent and expertise and experience of musicians available here is just unbelievable. You have absolute world-class musicians at available to do sessions. So you do yourself a favor by hiring someone with experience like that. It's I would say that's probably my second favorite part of the job in general, besides the people that I get to meet and hang out with, is being in a room with great musicians, whether they're pro session players or just a really great band, and just getting to listen to the music go down and going, yeah, man, this is fucking great. So I kind of got off topic there. Remind me once again. I'm just thinking of like, you know, rocking drummers and bass players and stuff.
Yeah, I think it was just about guiding, you know, if you're hiring a
Oh
session
yeah.
musician to play on your track, just giving them an idea of what you want while still giving them enough leeway to do what they do best.
I have found that the session musicians I've worked with have, you know, 99 times out of 100 been so accommodating and positive and ready to deliver what the artist wants, and it's a special skill set of a session musician to be able to listen to an artist who is sometimes maybe vaguely describing what they're hearing, and then to come up with a bunch of options and say, are you thinking something like this, maybe a groove like that, or do you have a song in mind that you're, you know, kind of thinking of that fits the vibe. So again, just communication is key. Thankfully, it is. I think it's just part of the session musician ethos to be like open and accommodating to that, and you know, they're deliver for the artist, and I've found that to always be the case. Yeah, I don't know how else I can answer that. If you I guess I could say that again, if you're looking for a drummer, bass player, guitar player, whoever, piano player for your session, consult with your producer, because chances are they'll have a lot of these people in their network, and they'll be able to help you straight away before anything find a person who is right for that kind of thing, for whatever kind of music you're doing. If you're doing a country song, okay, who might we pick for that? If you're doing a metal song, okay, who might be the best fit for that? And then right away you've set yourself up for success. And again, in Toronto, there are just the number of and the world-class level of musicians working out of the city, unbelievable.
Yeah, we've shouted out Toronto a few times, but it's a cool spot.
Yeah.
Awesome. Racing through this here, huge thanks to Kevin. Remember, musicworksplus.com/webinars. We've got a few titles highlighted here, including modern recording techniques, of which we're going to give away a copy to those of you that joined us, to one of you that joined us. Thank you very much for everyone's time and attention, though. And yeah, Sylvia Massey, Recording Unhinged, if you want to check that out. Huge thanks. You're going to get an email in the next 24 hours with a link to a recording of this session, so you can feel free to revisit, share it around as you see fit. KevinDietzMusic.com is the home base for our very special guest here. List of credits. Most importantly, though, you can contact him there if you have any further questions, or maybe like what you hear and want to make some music with someone that, as we've displayed, is very, very good at it.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Oh, no, the thanks belong to you. This is awesome. Again, KevinDietzMusic.com, CanadianMusician.com. My name's Andrew King, Editor-in-Chief of Canadian Musician, and we'll be back next month with our next session. This one's called Killer Record Release Strategies. Rick Barker, the man who used to manage Taylor Swift, he's now managing Trent Harmon. He's a social media mentor for American Idol and The Launch here in Canada. He's going to be joining us, whether you're releasing an album, an EP, or a single that you recorded in the studio with tips from Kevin. He's going to help you come up with a plan that's going to maximize the impact of that release and get it in front of as many people as possible. nwcwebinars.com for all the details on that one, including to register. And yeah,